All right, everyone. Trump went to Chicago the other day to hold a rather large rally and said that the city was an embarrassment overrun with crime, and this has offended exactly two people in Chicago and basically everyone with a D after their name. This brings me to a question. What strategic advantage is gained by doing this? He's running against a highly liberal inner city area in which he's only going to get a handful of votes in a state that he's probably not going to be competitive in. But he can create a situation in which he's framing himself as being the opposite of these various inner cities. He's done this before, like with Baltimore. He says it's rat-infested, which it literally was. When he talks about Chicago being overrun with crime, there is no argument or debate to be had. It is overrun with crime. Parts of Chicago are basically third world with regards to the level of violence. Somebody, I think this was a couple of years ago, they had a YouTube video, and I'll try to dig it out or something, I'll listen to it. It was just like an hour of ambiance sort of in central Chicago, and it was nonstop gunshots. Like that was, there is no quiet time in Chicago. Even when the din of traffic dies down, all you can hear is gangs yelling at each other and shooting randomly. The number of shootings in certain instances over the weekend in Chicago dwarf that of entire months in even other large cities in the United States. Chicago, having been run by the far left lock, stock, and barrel for a very, very long time, is fundamentally close to insolvency, overrun with gang violence, and totally dysfunctional. It is an embarrassment. Now, people in Chicago at first may balk at this. Well, we're proud of being Chicagoans. Great. You want Chicago to be a good place, tackle the problems that are happening in Chicago. New York did this. New York did this under Giuliani notably, and they shoved their crime rate down into the trash bin. And now New York is seen as a relatively safe-ish inner big city. Comparably to St. Louis, compared to Chicago, compared to Washington, D.C., which will always be a hellhole, and there's nothing to be done about it because it's where all the politicians and lawyers are. Chicago is a shithole. Of course it is. There are nice neighborhoods within Chicago. There are areas that the police are frequently there in that tend not to have any gang violence going on, but by and large, a lot of it is blighted. That's the problem of city government and the high tax and spend liberal policies of the state of Illinois. Trump's not blaming the people of Chicago uniquely and calling them scum. He's running against the inner city mentality. He's appealing to rural and small town and suburban outer city voters when he does things like this. When he's at a rally in an inner city, keep in mind he's not primarily running for the people that he's actually talking to there. He's running for a totally different demographic, which is the people that aren't there. The people that are watching on TV, or more often than not now on YouTube. That's what he's running on. This, by the way, is a smart strategy. There will inevitably be more people outside of Chicago watching him than people in the rally in Chicago. Republicans are scarce as hen's teeth there. There aren't a whole lot of independent voters in inner city Chicago either. I mean, you'd think, why would he even bother holding a rally there? He'd be better off holding a rally in some small town adjoining it so that the people from Chicago that do support him, they'll make the trip. Because it's a once-in-a-lifetime sort of maybe thing, and then people there are more likely to support him. He can still pack a stadium of 20,000 people. It's effortless for him. He counts it as an off day if there's only 5,000 or 6,000 people watching him in some buttfuck village somewhere that has 50 people normally. That's considered a grave failure by his standards. That's not the problem. Why Chicago specifically? Could it be because it's one of the violence capitals of the Western world? Like it's on par with like a Venezuela or something? Similar politics involved, I wonder why. Of course. Trump did the right thing. He's calling out reality for what it is. People in some of these cities would like to ignore that fact, or they'd like to blame Trump. They'd like to blame institutional racism as why Chicago sucks. No, Chicago sucks because the politicians running it suck. They would rather take your money than actually solve any problems. There's no attempt to solve problems. If it was calm, if things were peaceful, they wouldn't be voting for far-left individuals, probably, because there wouldn't be any need for so-called progress, which will never actually be delivered. Here's the myth of progressivism. The myth of progressivism is that after centuries of incremental change, a little more incremental change will suddenly be the silver bullet that solves all your problems. A little bit more government, a little bit more tax, a little bit more regulation, a little bit more will finally solve the problems that have been lingering in some cases for decades or centuries. You don't need any form of significant overhaul. You don't need to revert back to the way things used to be because maybe it was preferable. Maybe in some cases the treatment is worse than the disease. Neither of those are the case, the traditionalist argument or maybe the more radical forward-thinking argument. No, we need progressivism, a little bit more liberalism here and there. But we're going to abandon classically liberal, principles like not censoring people in the process. And just tax people out of house and home will be decadent and put them in honeycomb-like Cthulhu fucking structures, like it's an H.P. Lovecraft novel. By the way, this doesn't have any impact on people's mentality in inner city regions. Sometimes I think the replacement of more modernist or simply classical architecture is some sort of political sub-movement. It's a really degenerated thing. But anyway, getting back to the central point. Trump holds a rally in Chicago, insults the city. Oh my God, everyone's worried about this. Most of the pundits that are saying that it's wrong for him to do this are not from Chicago. They certainly don't live in the parts of Chicago that he's talking about. They live in a gated community. They're not in... It's like if he goes to Detroit and says, wow, what a fucking mess. Of course Detroit's a fucking mess. There's places in and around Detroit that aren't. There are gated communities that are just as nice as where I am right now in small-town Netherlands. There are places that are as peaceful as Switzerland, right next to Detroit. They're just not the middle of Detroit, now are they? Or Cleveland, or St. Louis, or any of these other places. New Orleans, Los Angeles, some of the big cities in this country that have higher crime rates. It's funny, LA is no longer even a top 10 example. I think what's number one? Is number one Flint, or is it like Detroit? I know Chicago's in the top 10, and DC's always in the top 10. New York fell out a long time ago. St. Louis, I know, is on the list. I can't remember how the listings... I used to be able to pretty much read it verbatim. I should probably study up on it, because some of those facts now are 5 or 6 years dated. You got to keep up to date on these things if you want to analyze politics and crime trends. By the way, we're not even in a crime spree in the United States. Our crime rates are near a 50-year low. Gun crime, violent crime overall, most forms of property crime, most meaningful forms of crime that actually violate the NAP are down at multi-decade lows right now. It upticked a little bit in the last year and people freaked out. It was really funny to see that happening. We're nowhere near the crime sprees of the 70s through the 2000s. That doesn't mean that there aren't cities, though, that have bucked that trend because they failed to reform anything. The states and cities threw a bunch of money at the problem. It got squandered on the corrupt. They were almost always far-left individuals. I'm not saying they're the only ones that are corrupt, but they're the ones that were in power in these places. Nothing changed, and the inner city stayed blighted. These people are nuts for continuing to vote for Democrats. They obviously can't solve your problems after 50 or 60 years of constant abuse. Here's the secret. They don't want to uplift some inner city black community out of poverty, because if they do that, they might stop voting far left. They lose their jobs. Oh my God. It's almost as if they're interested mainly in money. But it's difficult for people to get past the more racism thing. Well, there's no racism involved. These places are run by the constituents of the inner city. They tend to lean very heavily far left. In many cases, they're majority-minority. You can't really blame some white hayseed farmer out in the middle of Iowa for what happens in New Orleans, or some small towner living in fucking rural New Hampshire with a dirt-floored fucking unheated cabin up in the woods. They're not responsible for what happens in New York City or what happens in Chicago. They're not responsible for something taking place half a world away in San Francisco. They're not a constituent. They're not involved with it. They're not even in the same state, and they're still getting blamed, and how funny it is. People would rather chase ghosts than actually tackle their real issues sometimes, because the real problems require actual thought to tackle. That's about all. Peace out.